If you like the channel and want to see more videos like this, check out the links in the description below. The PlayStation 2 is the greatest console to ever exist. I will not accept an idea that states otherwise. Some of the most important and genre-defining games came out on this console. I could talk about its library for hours because, frankly, it's massive, but in this video series I want to hone in on a certain genre, and that is hack and slash action games. We could argue what the definition is, character action, hack and slash, whatever, not important. The thing that I really want to talk about is the games themselves, especially the ones that I feel like have gone under the radar and are underappreciated. With over 4,000 games coming out on the console, it was inevitable that some things would be forgotten or lost in the shuffle. So with this video series, I want to talk about the things that are relatively more obscure. Everyone has talked about DMC and God Hand and God of War to death. I want to talk about the stuff that nobody's really heard of or nobody really cares about. Try to get some interest in them and try to expand people's horizons. The list of games I plan to cover for this series has reached at least 100. If you want to see what I plan to cover and play them first before I make a video on them, click the link to the list on Backlogged in the description below. When I initially started my quest to cover all the PlayStation 2 action games out there, in my first review I did for Gungrave, I mentioned how Red Entertainment was a studio that has made a bunch of cool games I eventually wanted to cover, one of those being Blood Will Tell. After playing it to near 100% completion, this game has only further cemented Red as one of my favorite and underrated studios of the era, making such unique and ambitious games with experimental ideas and cool presentation. It only makes me even sadder that we never got their Trigun game because it probably would have been sweet. In my mind, they were one of the premier studios to get for adapting an anime or a manga during the PlayStation 2 era. Yes, I'm aware that the Gungrave game came first before the anime, but they capture the aesthetics and overall game feel that you would want from an adaptation, like Yuke's Berserk game we've already covered. Sadly, we don't really get games like this, Garo, Berserk, and Samurai Champloo Sidetracked anymore. Bandai would rather shit out half-baked copy-and-paste arena fighters that are missing basic features and are already completely abandoned after being out for a week. For the unaware, Blood Will Tell is an adaptation of Osamu Tezuka's Dororo. I'm not sure why it's called Blood Will Tell in America, since in Japan they just kept the same name as the manga, but I assume Paul Marketing thought this was too Japanese for our feeble burger brains to not get confused by. I had actually read a bit of the manga before playing this game, since I loved watching Astro Boy with my dad growing up and wanted to see Tezuka's other works, so it was cool to see how they went adapting designs and panels into 3D. I really appreciate that while they went for very realistic proportions and aesthetics for the human characters, the demons did not lose their original flair. Part of the amazing presentation of this game is the illustrations by Blade of the Immortal author Hiroaki Samura. Things like the Wikipedia only list them as drawing the much better Japanese cover of this game, but a lot of the in-game stills shown in the opening hours look really similar to their art style. Some of the art might have been done by other artists at Red Entertainment, but regardless of who did what, it all looks incredible. The color and texture work are so vivid and vibrant. Even the opening cutscene from when you boot up the game that the inferior Western cover is a still image of looks fantastic even by today's standards. I can only imagine how this blew people away back in 2004. I also loved the cinematography for the in-game cutscenes, specifically how the demons moved within them. They have such a fun kinetic movement to them, similar to some of the stuff found in Garo. It feels purposefully reminiscent of Japanese theater with characters moving as if they were actors on wires. But the cutscenes and art aren't the only things that I love about this game's presentation. There are moments in gameplay like when you fight behind shoji door panels and all you can see is the silhouettes of your character and the enemies. The most impressive stuff is how they adapt the story of Dororo into gameplay. As always with these videos, expect spoilers, but if you want to find out what these things are for yourself, skip to this part of the video and play the game for yourself first. I think this game hosts a very unique experience that I haven't encountered anywhere else, and I would want people to see it for themselves first, going in completely blind. So the story of Dororo is about a young boy named Hyakimaru, who as a child was offered to the demons by his father for power. These demons would go and steal 48 body parts from baby Hyaki, and after his father saw what happened to his son, he was filled with regret for his actions. He then took his son and sent him down a river where he would eventually be found by a man named Jukai. Jukai was a physician who would then make a new body for the now deformed and abandoned Hyakimaru, allowing him to lead a relatively normal life. That was until demons started showing up around them and eventually told of his origins, being instructed to kill the 48 demons who stole his body or kill the human of their creation using his parts, thus beginning our journey of the 48 boss fight gauntlet. Because of the mystical prosthetics given to Hyakimaru, gameplay goes through many changes as you kill more and more demons and reclaim certain parts of your body. There are even pretty elaborate cutscenes for major organ regains. While not as graphic, they do remind me of the transformation scenes from the previously covered Altered Beast. Because Hyakimaru doesn't have eyes, using his third eye to see, the first 30 minutes or so of the game are in black and white until you kill the boss to reclaim your left eye. I think it's really funny that the game has to open with a prompt that says, "No, there is nothing wrong with your TV, the game is supposed to be in black and white." This probably means that people were confused by this in focus testing if they did any of that, or at the very least feared people would be when they eventually played the game on release. Because Hyaki doesn't have any vocal cords and communicates telepathically until you beat the tutorial boss, his voice has this filter put on it for the first few lines of dialogue and combat barks.
I will take back all the 48 body parts the fiend stole from me.
Initially, I thought this was just a result of a shitty English dub, like the audio quality issues of Fatal Frame 3, where everyone sounded like they were speaking out of the finest soup can the recording team could find. When I realized this was an intentional thing, it got me really excited to see what else they could have up their sleeves for this game. On the topic of the dub, it's overall good, especially for the time. There are some goofy line deliveries, like when Hyaki gets his voice back.
I got my voice back!
But things like the narrations sound fantastic.
The 48 fiends have each taken a part of your body, young Hyakimaru. You must slay these fiends and retrieve what is rightfully yours.
It isn't until Hyakimaru reclaims his central nervous system does the game give you controller vibration. Yeah, the guy has no sense of touch, so how do we convey this to the player? We take away the one thing that interacts with the player in the physical world. It's such a creative approach to storytelling that only a game can accomplish. This didn't even cross my mind until I got it back and felt the controller shake for the first time. It took me by surprise, the same way experiencing the sense of touch for the first time must have felt for Hyakimaru. You can thankfully turn it off if you want in the settings because controller vibrations suck 97% of the times in games, but I really cannot gush enough about how cool and creative this idea is. Whoever thought of this needs to be working with Kojima because who knows what those two could be cooking up if they were locked in a room together. Though, while these aspects are really cool and lend themselves to one of the most unique experiences I've had with an action game, there are sadly others that are actively bringing the gameplay down for large parts of this game. It isn't until you get one of your legs back at the end of Chapter 1 do you unlock the ability to sprint. Now, that may not sound that long, and maybe my playtime was longer than the average player because I'm going over all of the levels with a fine-tooth comb trying to find any secret that I can, but I reached the end of Chapter 1 3.5 hours into my playthrough. Part of this is because of the level design of this game, which pre-getting sprint is definitely adding time compared to after having it. The levels of Blood Will Tell are very similar to the Berserk PS2 game's levels, overly large wastelands that you have to trek through while fighting never-ending hordes of demons. Chapter 1 feels like one of the largest levels of this game, with only the final chapter feeling more absurdly big. So before you finish this chapter, you just have to slowly walk your way around from one end to the other. And the story is certainly going to be making you get your steps in for the day. Once you do get the sprint, traversal does become less daunting, especially when you have to backtrack, but at the end of the day, these maps do not need to be this big. The parallels and comparisons to the Berserk PS2 game don't stop with the unnecessary size of the levels, but also with how I found myself just running past enemy encounters after a while, because if I stopped to fight every single little enemy that spawned in, I felt like I was never making progress. The game really should have implemented a begin from this point style replaying of levels. There are so many save points that if you could just start from one of them or at least warp to them, it would cut down so much on pointless backtracking, instead of like it is now where you have to start from the very beginning of each chapter. So if you have to get to something at the very end of the map, then you have to go possibly miles. For the longest time before I went back and tested it on a fresh save, I also believed that the dodge was tied to getting the left leg too. This is not the case. You have it from the start, it's just that the game does not tell you about its existence at all. You have to be in strafe mode while holding down L1 and pressing X while pushing the left analog stick in any direction. Why the game does not mention this in its tutorial or menus is beyond me and actively changes my perception of the game. It turns out that they do mention this in the manual for this game, but seeing seeing as it has now become a $400 game for some reason, so unless you hunt down the PDF on the Internet Archive, you aren't going to know this going into it without prior information of its existence. Originally, I was going to complain about how this hurts boss fights because before you would have the dodge, you could only run around them, making the fights feel reminiscent of the Berserk Muso game, rubbing your stick on the leg of a boss until they eventually fall over while not reacting to you at all beforehand. There is also no block or parry to my knowledge, so this also adds to the disconnect when fighting a lot of bosses. It also hurts the scripted segments where you are fighting humans and must perform non-lethal combat. This involves strafing your opponents and hitting them on the back with the dull end of your sword so you can deal massive damage and knock them out. The lack of a block or a parry when you can be fighting 20 dudes at the same time easily results in you getting stun-locked to death. The camera for this game is the same as a few of the games we've covered previously, like Gungrave Overdose, where you move the camera with the right stick for slow, awkward panning before it snaps right back into place behind the player character when you let go. Like with Altered Beast, you're mainly going to be recentering the camera by tapping L1. Because of this camera's implementation, it makes the platforming in this game be really annoying. Thankfully, these segments are few and far between, but I always felt that I never had good depth perception when having to do some of these jumps. The last complaint that I have before I want to start talking about the combat of this game is some of its lack of clarity at times. So as we've already gone over, the main objective is to kill the 48 demons, meaning we have 48 boss fights, though it's not actually mandatory to do this. Obviously, you should do this because otherwise you don't get the true ending and aren't at your strongest, but the only mandatory ones that you must fight are the bosses on the path of the main story. It's usually 2 or 3 for each of the 7 main chapters. The rest are all optional, with a bunch only encountered on replaying levels and backtracking. Thankfully, replaying levels just dumps you into the sandbox of said chapter and does not make you redo any story objectives. The issues start when it feels like a total crapshoot to get some of these demons to spawn. Some are pretty obvious, like you see this ledge that you can jump from with a pressure plate that you could press down like the one you did earlier. When you see that it does not react to you standing on it normally, you can put 2 and 2 together. But then there are others like the Forest of Chapter 6 where you have to destroy these specific statues. This is 100% where Itsuno got the idea for that shitty Forest of Illusion or whatever the hell it was called in DMC4. It's the same maze that requires a guide for the first time you go through because I'm too stupid and every room looks the exact same. There are also ones that only spawn in previous levels after you get to a certain point in the story, either because you have a new upgrade like getting the cannon's damage increase so you can break the boulders blocking the combat arenas in Chapter 1 and 2, or because a story beat has happened. Without looking up a guide to tell you, hey, come back here after beating Chapter 6, you can easily think that you are missing something about the level that is preventing you from getting in there. The main menu is just saying that there is X number of demons remaining in the level, so this all could have been avoided if it just had any sort of signposting to come back later that is more clear, because it kinda has it with certain lines, but it can easily be interpreted as, oh, there must be something in the level that I could find to do this. The other part that adds to the confusion for me was that Dororo has this mode where you can send them for scouting, and they'll be able to sniff out demons and hidden stuff. Every time I'd replay the first level to find the final demon in it, I would get this line from Dororo.
Something's not right.
While going up these giant steps. I think they're referring to this hidden part you could jump up to, but I found that in my first time through the level, so I feel like it shouldn't have kept playing over and over again even when I jumped to it. This caused me to think I am missing something and just had to rub my character against every wall while mashing the interaction button, or swinging my sword against every wall in the off chance that there is an illusionary wall, or some sort of hidden path. The combat manages to hit a nice sweet spot on both the mechanical depth and the is it just fun to play spectrums. No, it's not as deep as anything out of Capcom from this era, but it also is not completely mindless as Space Sheriff Spirits or 7 Samurai 20XX. It's slightly above things like the Sword of Etheria and Nano Breaker with a decent amount of combos and decent yet simple feeling air combat. Yakimaru has 2 stances that you can swap between at any time by hitting L2. You have the single long katana, which starts out rather slow and lacking at first, but as you play more of the game and it levels up from using it, along with finding any of the hidden swords swords scattered throughout the levels that have different properties, this stance actually becomes the more fun of the two. It becomes much more useful later in the game too because of its longer range, which makes dealing with these spear enemies much easier. The second stance is the one that sets this game apart style-wise from a lot of the others on the market at the time. Hyaki shoots off both of his prosthetic arms to reveal swords underneath them, giving you a fast but short-range style of combat. Combos with this stance look so cool as you start doing 360 spins in the air and mid-air somersaults that look like he was taking notes from Sonic's spin dash. This stance also gives you a gun, which is very useful versus some of the flying enemies or enemies with annoying hitboxes like the fire wheels. I don't know what it is about this enemy archetype, but they are so frustrating to fight in every game they are present in. They're so annoying in this game when you have to play as Dororo, and your punches are so short range. It just feels like bullshit trying to fight them. Your other ranged projectile is your leg cannon, which I mentioned earlier. This functions like Guts' arm cannon, where it's a great way to deal big damage at a distance or clear out bundles of enemies that would otherwise stun lock you if you tried to face them head on. Unlike Guts' arm cannon, this has an ammo count rather than being on a meter. When the meter under your health bar is full and glowing, you can hit square and triangle at the same time to do a super move. You start out with this massive spinning AoE attack that gives you invincibility frames, which is good for dealing huge damage to bosses while dodging some of their bullshit attacks and grapples, but also with dealing with large hordes of enemies. Hidden throughout the game are these scrolls you can pick up which give you other super moves, so definitely make sure to break environmental objects whenever you see them, because you never know which one is going to be hiding an incredibly strong game-changing super move. The last thing in your arsenal is holding down triangle until the sword explodes with a shimmer and stabs an enemy, initiating a QTE sequence. The more prompts you successfully do in the time limit and hit triangle again will give you both this super stylish looking execution screen along with giving you much needed rewards like health items, ammo, and these green little orbs which if you collect 100 of will give you a 1-up. If you mess this up at any point, the sequence will end and you will get no rewards, but there is nothing stopping you from just doing it again as long as the enemy didn't die and you don't get hit by any of the other enemies around you. I don't know what it is about this QTE, but my brain is just not wired to be able to competently do this to get this above 16 button presses successfully. It's simply too hard for me, and boy, is that going to come and bite me in the ass later. As I mentioned earlier, there are segments in this game where you get to play as Dororo. Think of these as the Clank segments from Ratchet & Clank 1 and 2. Most of these remind me of the jail sequence from 2 because like Clank, Dororo is sneaking through tight areas that Hyakimaru would otherwise be unable to get through. Their combat is better than most of these type of playable buddy character segments. Dororo's uppercut is cleaner than some Street Fighter characters, though like I already complained about with the Firewheel enemies, your range is lacking for some enemy teams, feeling bullshit to fight and not designed for Dororo at all. You do have the ability to throw items, but most of these either suck or should be saved for scripted sequences. The only thing that you should know if you plan to play this game after watching this video is that during the Dororo segment in the prison, make sure to reload the save if you do not open one of the doors with the sword behind it. It is the only time you are able to acquire this sword. If you try to return back to this area later, you simply cannot get it. It is one of the few, if the only one that I'm aware of, that is a timed event in this game. This special sword is one of the 2 that I feel like is mandatory if you want to fight the true final boss and not have a hard time. If you end up missing this one, it sucks, but it's not the end of the world because there's always the second one you can get, which we'll bring up later. The reason I say this is because the true final boss can be a real ballbuster. I knew going into this playthrough to expect the worst because when I was making the backlog list of all the games I planned to cover for this series so viewers can play along, the top review for this game at the time mentioned how this was one of the worst bosses in the genre, and it certainly has all of the qualities to be agonizing like the Altered Beast final boss, since they are both multi-phase gauntlets with no checkpoints, absurd damage, and the worst camera in the game, but there are a few things you can do to mitigate potential headaches. I was stuck on this boss fight for a while and was only really able to beat it because I consulted this GameFAQs guide and watched this one boss rush video on YouTube to see how people were actually combating this thing. Before going into this boss fight, I think it's imperative to make sure that you have as many 1-ups and cannon ammo as you can get before going into this fight because you will likely need them simply because there is a lot of unavoidable damage in the camera camera isn't the best during this fight. Those blue projectiles that the boss shoots at you in the first phase, if broken before they hit you, will drop cannon ammo. The stone pillars in the area can be broken and contain healing items, but the boss's large swings often break them and cause the items to time out and despawn before you ever need them, or even realize this happens, since it's off-screen in the boss camera mode keeps your view centered on the beast. During the second phase, go to the right and try to be parallel with the fingertip of the top right arm. This was roughly the sweet spot where I was able to consistently be able to swat the sweeping arm back without taking any damage. It's not easy and it's going to take some time to get the timing down, so do some trial and error in this segment of the arena and hope for the best. You are probably going to want to turn off the boss camera during parts of the third segment where it is just shooting this beam forward so you can get a better path towards the tail, and make sure to use the super move right before it grabs you, or else it will throw you into that beam for guaranteed damage. For this segment, it is probably best to switch to a sword, which might do less damage than your best sword, but builds super meter much faster. That way you can get multiple supers off on a single attempt on the beast's back. The final segment is easily the worst one and almost made it so I could not beat this game. This phase starts by the boss flying from outside of the arena directly at you, and you must do the triangle charge stab correctly, and then do a combo in a rhythm where you aren't too slow but aren't too fast, since each hit pushes the boss's head back, meaning that you can miss if you go too fast. It's very frustrating and difficult to time both parts of this because you have this terrible depth perception with the forced camera from the boss camera mode, which you cannot turn off here for some reason. The only instance of this in the entire game, by the way. Once you successfully do this, its heart pops out, which is holding Dororo hostage. You then must do the QTE attack you've been doing all game for a super cool, thematically pleasing 48 slashes, representing the 48 demons you have killed. Now you may remember what I said earlier, that I am terrible at this and struggle to get above 16 successful hits. To kill the final boss, you must do a 48 button QTE sequence with 0 mistakes and no assistance. I simply could not do this normally, and it is why I said to not miss the Sword of the Twin Clouds when playing as Dororo in the prison. I sadly did, because I did not consult a guide until I was stuck on the true final boss and had no way to get it. I don't know what this sword does, but I assume it might skip the QTE based on the item description included in said guide. Thankfully, the second sword is just sitting in the final boss room of the previous chapter before unlocking the true ending. This does mean you have to run through the largest map in the game, which can take easily at least 15 to 20 minutes without even fighting any in every enemy you encounter. The blade you get here, the Sword of the 8th Cloud, is the only reason I was able to beat this boss, because not only does it slow the QTE down, which I still managed to screw up somehow, but it saves your place in the QTE, so if you redo the Bull Rush segment without dying, you can just pick up where you left off, which is what I did. I got up to 21 slashes the first time and then got the remaining slashes the second time to finally beat the game after struggling on this boss for hours. I'd say that Altered Beast, Shinobi, and Nano Breaker still have more annoying enemies based on what we've covered so far, but without the easy mode sword and figuring out how to abuse some of the jank of this game, it would be right up there with those three. Once you beat the game, you unlock Dororo mode, which is a time trial segment where you can play through repurposed main story levels trying to get collectibles before the timer runs out. I did not find it all that enjoyable, but it's cool that it's there to begin with, and it does allow you to unlock some really nice concept art. Blood Will Tell is easily one of the best PS2 action games we've covered so far. It's one of the few that ends with me not wanting to snap the disc in half and never touching it again. It could have easily gotten to that point if there weren't the buffers for the annoying final boss, but its combat is fun and addictive, and the presentation is some of the coolest on the console. It's a shame that this game is now going for like 400 plus USD for some reason, despite the fact that people have said, yeah, I picked that shit up in a bargain bin for $5 years ago. I'd love to add add it to my collection and even saw it once recently out in the wild, but unless I start making Mr. Beast levels of money instead of barely covering my rent for some months, I don't think I could ever justify that purchase. There's no game out there that's worth this much money. I'd love to see a re-release for this game and highly recommend everyone to go out and play it for yourself on an emulator or a modded PlayStation 2. This is one that you do not want to miss out on. This is going to be kind of a weird one. Not for anything within the game itself, as it is a fairly standard affair, but more so because of the journey I had with this game. When I really wanted to start this series of covering all of the PlayStation 2 action games that were DMC adjacent, I went through tons of lists to find everything that could be attributed with these qualities. There are probably games out there that fall into this category that are not on the backlog list of games that I plan to cover, and when I originally found this game, there wasn't really much to go off of for it. There is still, at the time of writing this, no Wikipedia page for this game. There is no GameFAQs guides for it, with only 2 posts on GameFAQs about this game that are both left unanswered. The backlogged page is basically a placeholder that doesn't even have a release date listed. It was the first and only game that I ever had to import from Australia. Then I finally actually get to playing the game for the video, and as I am watching the expository opening, I am wondering, was this an adaptation of Chinese mythology, or maybe a wushu novel/movie? So after playing through a few levels, I took a break and went to look this up, which sent me down another rabbit hole. First, Google thought I was talking about the Witcher novel of the same name, then it thought I was talking about a movie with the same name, then Google got it confused with a Steam game of the same name that came out in 2020. Finally, I was able to narrow it down to the right game, but like I mentioned a minute ago, there is next to nothing about this game online, at least in English. I clicked on this Hardcore Gaming 101 article for the game and came to the revelation that this was made by the dudes that made Blinks. Then it mentions how they were co-developing a game called The Sword of Yi before The Sword of Destiny with a studio that would later become Atari Melbourne. Those are the guys that made the PlayStation 2 Transformers game. I have weird memories of that game from playing it at my cousin's house when I was a kid. I really need to go back and play it at some point, because I haven't touched it since the year it probably came out, and I was like 6 years old. The Unseen 64 article that Hardcore Gaming 101 linked to about The Sword of Yi basically says this was a game that existed at one point, and then it didn't. It may have been connected to this game, but we basically know nothing about it, so One of the opening cutscenes after the first chapter mentions the Sword of Yi as this magical MacGuffin that you were going to have to collect to defeat the Demon Lord, so maybe the Sword of Destiny is what the Sword of Yi eventually became after the original plan and co-development fell through. The only other thing I wanted to mention from the little of the Hardcore Gaming 101 article that I read before closing the page and going back to playing this game is that they compared it to both Bujingai and Shinobi. Initially I was like, yeah, I see the Bujingai comparisons. I had noted and planned to bring up how some of the environments, particle effects, and aesthetics were similar, probably in part because both have ancient Chinese mythology as a base for their aesthetics. But I did not see the Shinobi comparison at all. The only thing that I had noted before starting this Google search rabbit hole was that the starting throwing item, the heavy spell, stunned enemies the same way that your kunai did in Shinobi, down to both having a similar static effect put on the characters. The only other thing that I could think of was that all three games had hilariously bad English dubs and audio mixing.
Would you listen to a story about my cursed upbringing?
Keep this comparison in mind because it will come up later, but for now let's get into actually explaining this game. Of course, the Sword of Destiny has basically no settings to fiddle with. Previously, all the imported games that I have played that never came out in America, but were released in Japan or developed by Japanese devs that came out in Europe, all had a 60Hz option I could select when recording. This is the first game that does not. This meant I sadly could not play this game on my CRT because it was stuck at 50Hz. There is no controller or layout rebinding settings, but thankfully the camera isn't inverted, so that ended up not really mattering. The game opens to you in a tutorial room where you are going to be explained most of the game's mechanics. It does a pretty decent job at teaching you them, considering this is during the era it was pretty hit or miss of having a good tutorial or even any one at all. The one thing that does suck about this tutorial is that it constantly stops to give you prompts and telling you what to do, despite all of the things it's trying to teach you are timing based, so this tutorial did not really give me a good feel for doing things like the launcher, or to properly follow up on sword time, but we'll get into that later. This is where I started to notice the Bujingai similarities, because both tutorials look like they're kind of in similar areas. It even has a HUD element like Bujingai's Defense Lotus, but it looks much worse. It looks like an overly blown up texture that is starting to blur because it was never meant to be seen this big, and just seems all around low quality. This is where the similarities with the Lotus begin and end, because that system was all about defense in Bujingai, and this is all about offense in the Sword of Destiny. This is a meter tied to your sword time system. When locked onto an enemy while holding L1, there will be a period when the blue lock-on turns red. If you strike an enemy during this window, it will activate. Think of what happens next as kind of a combination of DMC Devil May Cry's double trigger that launches all enemies into the air, and the Zandatsu from Metal Gear Rising. It's a counter akin to the one in Garo, but it's not a QTE prompt like it is in that game. It also fucking sucks in this one and barely works because the window for these counters are so small, while your attacks are so awkward and at times super slow because of how the sword swings, or how long the game takes to respond to your inputs, or because you were trapped in animations because you can't animation cancel most of your moves in this game, along with enemy hitboxes being so disjointed, so even if you do time it right and you manage to be in range to hit them instead of overshooting your dodge or dash, which you have little control over, you are just hit and will be sent flying, so the whole exercise was pointless to begin with. If I had to compare this to any of the other games I've covered so far, then the one this has most in common with is Nanobreaker. Both have a good foundational base to them, but are held back by the jank that could have been ironed out of these systems in place to make a much more fun and enjoyable game. There is a lot of stiffness to your movement despite your base move speed being good. Your dash is really fast and cool looking, your dodge also is fast, but both have their own set of issues that make it so they don't realize their full potential. When using your dash on triangle, it pivots the camera into a Dutch angle. It looks cool, especially if you are following it up with attacks from your blue dragon sword, but it often makes combat encounters really hard to follow, and if you are using this in succession like you can in some instances, then it makes your screen become a complete unintelligible mess. The two big issues with your dodge are both issues that the dash has as well. The dodge often makes it so you are too far away from your targets, so even if you do dodge their attacks and memorize the windows to get sword time, there is no way for you to actually get back in range in time before that period ends. The other is how the game seems to constantly eat your inputs or leave you animation locked in sword swings or other movement abilities. For a fast-paced game like this, I wish that the dash and dodge had a complete overwrite of any action you were currently doing and allow you to animation cancel into them. It would make comboing feel more fluid, and even if you did end up dodging too far, you'd still be able to dash back into range. I'd still try to do this and sometimes even manage to pull it off, but the game felt like it was its mission to prevent me from ever doing so. The other issues with the movement abilities go hand in hand with the combat, so let's establish the basics first. You have your main combos on square, you hold back on the left stick during that combo to do a launcher, you have unique weapon arts for each sword by pressing the right trigger, you have a dash attack by hitting triangle and then square, and you have a dodge attack by hitting circle and then square. Your combos feel good, they're fast and fluid. My personal favorite was the dodge attack with the Sword of Awakening, but there is one issue that is killing the creativity and combo ceiling of this game, and that is the inability to cancel out of the specific attacks that any of these buttons do. For example, the Sword of Awakening's dodge attack is a dodge, launcher, a hit in the air, and then a helm splitter. Sadly, you cannot do any other attack if you hit any of the other buttons while doing this. It would be so cool if you could do the dodge attack, launch an enemy, and then do the dash attack in the air to follow up and then do the basic air combo. Instead, you just have to do the same canned attack animations over and over again, and it starts to get repetitive. If you are locked onto a flying enemy, or an enemy that has been knocked airborne, you can press the triangle button, which will result in you flying through the air, like they are a stage actor on wires akin to Bujingai or Garo. When you do air combat like this, it's where you will see the game's systems start to fall apart. You will begin to realize that this game has a hard time finding new targets when in the air, despite actually being one of the few games where you can change your lock-on targets by pressing a button instead of clicking in the right stick or moving the analog stick or just simply not being able to do anything at all. You'll realize how easy it is for enemies, especially bosses, to break your lock-on or be right in front of an enemy or have an enemy behind you and the lock-on simply can't go from one enemy to another. You'll begin to notice how the game is even stiffer than you thought it was. It has been documented to hell and back how games like Kingdom Hearts Birth by Sleep have a jump that people have described as floaty, where you are suspended in the air for a period of time longer than you would think you should be after doing an action. Sword of Destiny is one of the worst I've come across if you do any air combat. The air combos themselves look cool and feel alright, it's what comes after that is the issue. Unless you are in sword time, if you fight an enemy in the air, you just fall directly down like a sack of bricks after the combo ends, after already being awkwardly left hanging in the air for a bit. If you don't manage to kill the enemy, the lock-on breaks as you are falling for some reason, instead of keeping the camera panned up or zoomed out on them. This makes the lava level such a pain in the ass, as most of the enemies here are these flying Ermac looking motherfuckers who just float over the pits of lava, so I fly at them and kill them only only to be stuck in the air for a few seconds and then fall right down into the pits while I was mashing any of my movement options trying to avoid this. All of the damage I took in this level was strictly from falling into the lava over and over again. I wish this shit played like Shinobi, where I could just fly at enemies through the air and still be able to dash as long as I am hitting something at least once between these airborne dashes. This stiffness feels reminiscent of the launchers in the first God of War, where there would be enough of a time where you were animation locked and unable to follow up enemies that you launched into the air, so you would not be able to juggle them as smoothly as if this limitation wasn't there. Both games would be better off without this and just having more fluid movement that your character could animation cancel out of. I do not get why the Sword of Destiny locked the follow-up movement behind being in sword time. It results in most of this game feeling a lot worse than it otherwise needs to be. It's not like this system doesn't already have the same lock-on issues regular air combat has either, so you lock better movement behind a limited ability and still have a shit time trying to track enemies. This makes these segments where you have the magically locked doors that you have to destroy the Buddha statues while in sword time absolutely infuriating. There's a few in particular, like the one I'm showing on screen now, where I could just not get the game to locate this statue so I could fly at it. It ended up trapping me in here way longer than it otherwise would if this was a well-functioning system. Instead, I just had to fight these guys over and over again, try to build enough meter, and hope that I could actually get the game to lock onto the statue. Though you can mitigate some of the annoyance by using the heavy spells, which when used on a smaller enemy and locked onto them will always activate sword time, at least from my experience. Maybe there are some instances where it won't. Speaking of sword time, let's talk about it and bosses. There are only a few bosses in this game, and when I say a few, I mean like 4 if you're counting the 2 forms of this lady, the final boss and the tutorial boss, which becomes a basic enemy a few missions later. The window for sword time during these fights are absurd. I had to go back and time it frame by frame, and it is a 10 frame window versus Yang Young. This is just as, if not worse than the window versus some of the Garo bosses on hard, a difficulty mode that I described as completely imbalanced, and only for the most masochistic of players. Like I already mentioned a moment ago, the game does give you a way to more consistently get sword time off by using the heavy spells on enemies which stuns them, but that doesn't work on bosses, and even when using it against basic enemies, the thing is so slow and has the weirdest arc. It is so much shittier than Shinobi's kunai that it is easy to just give up on using them. So you might be thinking, just ignore it if it's that hard or bullshit to pull off. Well, to deal any meaningful amount of damage to bosses, you must hit them during sword time. It turns out that a combination of my dyslexic ass, the tutorial which runs like ass, and my own lack of understanding what it was telling me made me realize that I didn't fully understand the sword mechanic initially. I don't know why my brain did not internalize when the tutorial said, when the timer is lit, you can continue sword time by using dash attacks. That was referring to these orbs as my timer, and not just some shitty HUD element. It took me about an hour before I realized this and felt extremely stupid for that being the case. But in my defense, it is in an awkward spot of the screen that I can tell you my eyes were never looking at because my focus was on the top middle of the screen where all of the enemies are forcefully launched because of the start of sword time. I've seen people complain that Devil May Cry 1's HUD does not clearly convey how much Devil Trigger you have left with these glyphs, and while Sword of Destiny's HUD element is basically the same thing as both glow bright blue to show that you do have time and then dark blue when you have no time, Sword of Destiny somehow manages to be even less clear than that. I don't get why this wasn't a meter, or at the very least an actual timer like the tutorial calls it, a la the armor time in Garo. The timer also keeps ticking down even as you kill all of the enemies and are stuck in the air because of the floatiness of the game. The only way I found to consistently stop the timer from going down is to let go of the lock-on button, and that seemed to do the trick most of the time. It wasn't until the boss fight with Yang Young did Hardcore Gaming 101's comparison to Shinobi finally click into place, and I was able to see what they were talking about. It was when I realized that you can actually deal massive damage during the sword time versus bosses. In reality, it's the only way to deal anything beyond chip damage, like I said a few paragraphs ago. But I wasn't expecting to be able to kill a boss in 1 or 2 sword times if I had a full meter. Just don't break the rhythm of follow-ups because you can't tell what the fuck is happening due to to the camera and tilting like I did. This is somewhat reminiscent of the sword powering up system Shinobi is all about, a distant inbred cousin of it, if you will. When all of the Tate circles in the top right corner from killing enemies in Shinobi glows, it allows you to one-shot bosses. Sword of Destiny, by comparison, allows you to stun lock and zip around bosses if you manage to hit them in the counter window and have the meter filled from either hitting or killing enough enemies leading up to the fight itself, or hitting the boss enough times and dealing enough chip damage. The excruciatingly small windows, clunky movement, and this being the only way to get through the bosses made me happy that this game basically has none. It's bad enough when you have to fight the red giant enemies with the spike maces that have the most disjointed hitboxes from the basic enemy lineup and the smallest window for sword time of the basic enemy lineup, and of course to add on top of that, they seem to not be affected by the heavy spells at all. Imagine if this game had the same number of bosses as Shinobi.
What a fucking nightmare.
We spent so much talking about sword time and the movement, I haven't even mentioned the other mechanic that this game has, which is kind of lackluster and poorly implemented. That being the sword collecting and sword swapping. The whole plot of this game revolves around you getting these 3 swords of Yi, like I brought up at the start. Our main character gets this cool sword holder that extends like a wing on his back for the 3 mythical swords. The 3 you get over the course of the game are like the 3 weapons you swap between in Onimusha 1. You have your blue fast multi-slashing sword, your orange slow greatsword, and finally your dual-ended sword that spins around, except it's red in this game instead of green like it is in Onimusha. Speaking of Onimusha, the challenge levels in this game kind of remind me of the challenge tower from Onimusha 2. Anyways, besides these 3 swords, enemies when killed have a chance to drop the weapons they are wielding. Initially you aren't able to wield these swords as you are told that they are corrupted by demons, but once you start collecting the swords of Yi, you can combine the 2 together, and the demon swords will imbue you with passive buffs and debuffs. For some reason the enemy dropped swords have durability, so use them too much and they break and you're stuck with the shitty ones that don't give you any benefits beyond raw stat numbers, while also giving you annoying drawbacks. There is also an RPG leveling system where you can dump XP gained from killing enemies into each of the 3 swords, leveling these 3 categories of air time, sword time, and strength up to 10. I'm pretty sure that leveling these swords up also dictates how much the fused swords potentially gain in stats, as before they are fused, you see the meters are only partially filled, and after they fuse, you see the meters grow potentially to the end or only a little. I honestly never noticed any differences when leveling, but maybe that's because the progression curve just keeps it static the whole way through if you are staying on curve and don't under or over level. Maybe if I went back to early levels of the game and fought enemies that are level 1, I'm just going to one-shot them. Who knows? The whole system is just really cumbersome, and I honestly hated having to engage with it. You constantly have to stop and go through these slow-ass menus to decide what swords you want and what buffs and drawbacks you are willing to put up with. Imagine swapping in DMC1, but instead of only having 2 melee weapons for 90% of the game, which you can still swap between in-game without pausing by clicking in the stick, you had to pick between 50 and most of them suck, and the good ones break too fast. You constantly see the sword holder expand on your back in cutscenes, so I was hoping this game would have some sort of active sword swapping mechanic, kind of like how you swap through your guns in Metal Wolf Chaos with the weapon base splitting open on your back. The only other thing I wanted to bring up is that partway through this game, I wasn't able to start a few of the missions because I guess I wasn't a high enough level to do them, so I did one of the Onimusha 2 looking challenge missions only to come back and those previous 2 missions were gone. I don't know why they disappeared, and maybe if I go through the game again on New Game Plus, I'd be able to see them, but it's just odd to begin with. Why would they make these missions disappear? So my curiosity got the best of me, and I downloaded a 100% save file for this game because I was not going to do the annoying grinding that would be required to unlock the 2 super weapons, the Sword of Infinity and the Sword of Absolution, which require you to get 750 and 999 red orbs respectively. Both of these swords change up gameplay quite a bit, as the Sword of Absolution makes it so every time you lock onto an enemy and hit them, it will activate sword time. It doesn't give you unlimited, but you can basically chain it back to back as long as you're close enough to the enemy that you could infinitely do it. The sword changes your appearance, and it kind of reminds me of the main character from Sun Ken Rock. By comparison, the Sword of Infinity allows you to just spam your weapon art over and over again as it gives you unlimited meter. The one downside to this weapon is that it makes you fucking bald. Look at the
top of his head.
You would think that a game that has missable missions would allow you to at least select ones that you missed after beating the game, just like Gen 1 of Armored Core for the PlayStation 1. Instead, if you load up your completed save, it just boots you back to the main menu and allows you to do New Game Plus, having you select either new missions or the ones that you ended up missing. I did decide to go back and fully commit to doing a whole other playthrough to get to these levels, and while those levels are fine and I had an alright time going through them, specifically enjoying the ones that were more platforming focused, because surprisingly the platforming is pretty fun in this game, even with the issues with the dash and being stuck in the air like I mentioned, but I did not find it worth to have to go through these levels again just to get to the few unique ones. At this point the game had started to wear out its welcome. One other thing that I do want to mention I encountered on this second playthrough with the 100% save file were these enemies that I'd have to fight that were level infinity. These guys only showed up a few times, maybe 5 at most in this second playthrough, but I wish I knew what their deal was. Is this supposed to happen? Is this intentional? I assume it is, but I don't have any information because there's no documentation on this game or its systems, and that's really unfortunate and frustrating. The game itself is pretty short. It only took me just shy of 5 hours to beat, and that was also counting all of the time I had to stop to take notes while recording, so it's probably closer to 4, because there is a decent amount of footage where I'm just standing around writing notes for the video. It's not the worst game I've played for this series, but it's not the best either. It has some neat stuff in the visual department and in the game feel, but it's not one of the games that has me going, you have to go out and play this one right now. I'd recommend it as a play if you want to, but it's not the end of the world if you end up skipping this one. If you feel really starved for games in this genre, then I could think of a lot worse things to spend your afternoon playing than this, so give it a whirl if that's what you're looking for. Of all the things to get a PlayStation 2 adaptation, it's probably not a surprise that one of the most popular Japanese films, The Seven Samurai, got one. The more out there aspect about this adaptation is the fact that they decided to make it a futuristic diesel punk apocalypse with cyborgs and demons. At one point I considered covering all of the weird adaptations that The Seven Samurai has gotten over the years, and maybe I will eventually get around to doing that, but for now we're just going to take a look at one of the last games put out by Sammy Studios before they merged with Sega in October of 2004. This game's aesthetics are so cool. I remember first seeing this game in one of Giant Bomb's game tapes videos from the E3 it was revealed at. As soon as I saw that trailer, I had to know what it was. Part of this game, when in the cities, reminds me of both Final Fantasy VII and the original Blade Runner, with its metallic industrial skyscrapers draped with neon lights. Other segments feel reminiscent of late 90s and early 2000s anime, like the works of Yasuhiro Naito's Trigun and Gungrave. The standout part of this game's aesthetics are the character designs, which were done by French artist Mobius, who also did the art for the Panzer Dragoon games, so it shouldn't be a surprise at all that this game is filled with so many striking characters both in the main cast and the enemies you fight along the way. This is the grungy anime shit like early Guilty Gear that I love. There are these cool werewolf enemies, so many different robots, with this one reminding me of Big O. One of the main villains looks like if Yujiro ate Bob Sapp after being dipped in Tostitos steroids dip. Like every time you beat this guy, he then subsequently rematches you after injecting even more steroids to get even huger, to the point that at the end of the game, the guy looks like he's in the final minutes of Akira. It's easily the most exciting aspect of this game, seeing what weirdos pop out of the floorboards to attack you. There are a plethora of optional boss battles, and most of them look like they walked right off the set of a Saints Row 2 trailer, like this dude with an afro in a green suit who keeps saying hey 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 over and over again like he's Bill Cosby. Or this puppet-holding weirdo who looks like Jigen from Lupin the Third if he was sponsored by the blue raspberry cherry flavored Airhead. Or these twins who make it feel like you walked right into a completely different game, as if they were drag and dropped right from Jet Set Radio as they do a freestyle rap as their introduction before you beat their ass.
The betrayer, now he makes 6. And wouldn't you know it, the final number 7, Peanut is not here, the child of heaven. So hurry the hell up, cause we gotta go before the damn humanoids try to steal the show.
So why they all tripping?
about this girl.
The game aesthetically also reminds me of Xenosaga and Phantasy Star Universe with its character models and color choices. I was getting some major nostalgic flashbacks thinking about all the time I spent playing through the free areas of Phantasy Star Universe's demo on the Xbox 360 when I was in middle school. I have so many fond memories of laughing at the 4th or 5th floor, I can't really remember, which was completely overrun by bots and scammers. You'd walk there and you would see nothing but a barrage of messages being sent over and over again asking about doing Microsoft point trades. I hope no one ever actually fell for the Microsoft points for Megan Fox's nudes, but judging by some of the other kids I knew who played at the time, someone probably did. The cathedral in Chapter 7 feels reminiscent of the final level of Gungrave, and like Gungrave in a few of the other games I've covered before this, 7 Samurai 20XX is another one of those read the manual type games, because in the game itself, it does not explain anything for gameplay. It has a digital manual accessible from the main menu, which is what I think you really should read before hitting new game, otherwise you won't know any of its systems or how they work. There aren't any active tutorials, which I think probably should have been there. To compare this game's combat to any of the previously covered action games, its closest analog is probably Space Sheriff Spirits. It's incredibly shallow, with basic combat being done with one sword that is super slow and limp. It does marginally improve in game feel once you activate your Devil Trigger, which allows you to dual wield. When I first experienced this, I couldn't help but wonder why this wasn't how the game always felt, because it's so much more fun to play as, you are so much faster, the game feels way more responsive in this mode. You simply get to let loose when dual wielding. The combat would also feel much better with the inclusion of a lock-on. Yeah, it's one of those janky PS2 action games, akin to Nano Breaker, where you find yourself awkwardly swinging at the air because you have no way to track enemies around you, and enemies love to circle around you as if you're in the center of a mosh pit. Even in dual wield mode, there is still a noticeable amount of stiffness and input eating or input delay for actions. The lack of a lock-on and this stiffness make directional moves awkward to do since you don't have any way to anchor which direction you are facing, like a lock-on in other games would. So you'll often find yourself turning towards the camera when trying to do a backwards forward motion. The game also weirdly doesn't interact with the right analog stick at all. Instead, the camera just follows behind the player and pans when it thinks it needs to. You can mitigate some of the potentially bad camera angles, similar to the previously covered Altered Beast, by holding down the left trigger, which locks the camera behind where the main character is facing. After playing so many games lately with really bad camera and really bad camera speeds, it has made this feature really grow on me and makes me wish that it was something that was still an option in modern games today. The same way that I wish more games had sprint on a bumper or a trigger, freeing up one of the face buttons and making it so you don't have to constantly click in the left or right stick, which I absolutely detest. I am positive that this is accelerating controller drift. The other thing that adds to the clunkiness of gameplay is how much slowdown is present. Now, since I play all of these games on an actual PlayStation 2 instead of emulating them, this may be something you can avoid on the PCSX too, but there is a possibility that this is just something that is wrong with the game engine and it will be there regardless. Or there might be other issues with the game that are only present in emulation, like so many games unfortunately suffer from. But regardless of if that's the case or not, if too many enemies get on screen or if there are too many particle effects like when you have a high combo number and enemies are exploding and you're landing parries over and over again, the game drops to what feels like 30% of its normal speed. It's similar to the early Fatal Frame games where it doesn't get choppy frame rates, it simply just slows down. It runs a lot slower. It feels like you're trapped in bullet time. These explosions also make it really hard to see incoming attacks because you are being blinded by rainbow lens flares. Thankfully, the parry is probably the most forgiving that I have ever encountered, as you just press the triangle button and you don't even have an animation, you just have to vaguely hit it in the window and you'll automatically do it. It's not spammable, mind you, since it is tied to a meter, but regardless of this fact, it feels fairly rewarding to pull off since the sound it makes is so satisfying. And the fact that a perfect parry, or a just guard as it's referred to in-game, fully refills your Devil Trigger. So because of this, it allows you to pretty much stay in dual wield mode the entire time in any enemy encounter as long as you are landing them. The only times I was falling out of Devil Trigger were when I was fighting enemies that were too slow to actually attack. Some of these crash dummy looking robots just seem to move in slow motion, so I cut them to bits and make them explode before they even have a chance to hit me. This facet of the Devil Trigger and parry system does in turn make bosses, at least most of of them a complete joke. Boss fights is probably the most unique aspect of the combat system. When you encounter a boss outside of the tutorial one that is the big O robot that you start to encounter later as a basic enemy, the game turns into a 2.5D Tekken-style fighting game. Since they have swords, I guess a more accurate comparison is Soul Calibur, but you get my point. I haven't mentioned it up until now, but this game is very easy, and the fact that your parry window is so lax while giving you such an incredible reward for doing it, you are able to melt 95% of the bosses in this game. This also results in most of the bosses feeling very samey, with only a few standing out because either they had a strong enough shield, which is this red bar below the yellow one, which is their health, so I couldn't just unga bunga their health bar to death, or they had a gimmick of varying annoyance which makes them hard to hit, like the flying boss Zvi or the shadow boss Raksh Lambda. It's probably better off being like this in all honesty, because the combat does not have enough depth or variety to really make gimmick fights or unique mechanics shine. Zvi's boss fight really shows how bad a mold breaking fight can be in this game. You just can't fucking hit her most of the time. The rather basic shallow gameplay, along with the poor performance at times, does make some of the enemy gauntlets near the end of the game feel like a real slog. They just go on forever as they keep throwing more and more mindless mooks at you to get cut down, while the game speed is caught in the crossfire as collateral damage. If you die in any of these sequences, it sadly means a decent amount of lost progression and time, since there is no way to save in the middle of a chapter. Chapters are also decently long, so it makes it pretty annoying to try and find places to stop in this game. Unless you want to lose progress, you're going to have to play to the end of a chapter, which you never know how long you're going to be from that or where that even is. I wouldn't call this game open world, but it does drop you into some decently sized areas, which usually don't have anything to do in them unless you run into one of the optional bosses or are in one of these story sequences where you have to fight from one point of town to the other in a Yakuza-styled long battle. How are you gonna put in a legally distinct 7-Eleven and not allow me to go in there to fuck around? The gameplay isn't the only aspect of the game that they just drop you on your head with and don't explain anything. The game has little to no setup for its world, story, or really what's going on. If this was a direct adaptation of the film, I wouldn't really see this as that much of an issue, but I don't remember when Akira Kurosawa made Toshiro Mifune fight werewolves, mechs, and steroid-guzzling freak beasts. Like a lot of the Japanese games from this era with an English dub, the audio mixing is rather poor, and this predates the subtitles being a basic mandatory setting, so there are plenty of points in the game where it is really hard to hear and understand what characters are saying.
Good eye. I'm looking for a guy named Roji.
The cast itself features a lot of the popular voice actors you'd expect to hear from anime in the early 2000s, like Liam O'Brien and Crispin Freeman.
At last, with your mask stripped away, you have seen the truth.
The dub is pretty hit or miss. As I've already talked about, there are goofy weirdos that just either take you out of the moment or are going to make you laugh and like the game more, but I would describe the dialogue and story of this game in the same way that Cvit did in his Chasm the Rift video. It's filled with skinwalker sentences, stuff that sounds like an approximation of dialogue written by a real human, but there's just something really off about it, like it was created by aliens who have a limited understanding of how humans speak.
I haven't turned against you, Nato. You've been betrayed. You'll find out. Soon.
The optional bosses aren't the only weirdos found in this game. The main antagonists host a whole stable of freaks. You got Dracula if he was modeled after the creepy spider from Miss Spider's Sunny Patch Kids as he was walking right off the set of Hotel Transylvania. There is this evil Shaolin master who injects himself with the coveted dirty bulk and turns himself into a Deathclaw while screaming that he's coming. The final boss drags you into the Digimon Rumble Arena dimension as he throws his scarfs at you. Alternatively, the arena does remind me of the time travel sequences from Daikatana, or that data bridge area with Axel in Kingdom Hearts 2. The story itself is interesting. I liked the characters. Your cast, even when weirdly acted at times, are super charming, but nearly every time the story is getting interesting and pulling you in, the Skinwalker-isms show up. I don't know how to describe it other than there are simply things missing. Parts of the game that were either cut for time or budget. I'm leaning more towards that rather than claiming it was due to ineptitude, but some of the moments in the story feel as if they were edited like a shitpost. Roji's goth GF gets injected by Dracula's Green Goblin serum and also turns into a Deathclaw, giving you this sad moment where he has to come to grips with the fact that he has to kill his lover, who is now turned into a monster, otherwise she will destroy the city. You would think that you're now going to see Roji fight her, or maybe you would even play as him in a scripted event. Nope. It fades to black as he runs at her, and then it fades back into him sitting on the steps crying with her dead off screen.
There are so many things I wish I could have told her. Yeah.
Nothing ever gets time to sit and have any emotional impact because it's either cut short, quickly moved on from, comes in out of nowhere as if it was already established and you should be knowing what's going on, or as we just showed, outright missing segments. One of your longest running companions dies saving a villager from a falling rock because the dude's wife was turned into an oozing wall monster right out of Full Metal Alchemist, and it's moved on from in like a minute. The game just doesn't have time for its own story, and it's a shame. Once you beat the game, you unlock Survival Mode, which is a no item, no saves, permadeath playthrough of the game. I honestly can't imagine this actually being that enjoyable to try and speed run through in one sitting. The game itself isn't that long, it took me just shy of 8 hours to beat, but as always, my playtimes may differ from the average person. You have to give or take some time since I'm constantly stopping to write notes for the video, and I'm going over lots of areas in these games with a fine-toothed comb so I don't miss things since I'm trying not to play with a guide unless absolutely necessary. The shallow gameplay, few really annoying segments, and the poor performance do not make this game mode enticing at all. The other notable thing that happens when you beat the game is that you can equip swords or weapons that you collected from all the bosses you fought throughout the game. You even get the ability to use Kai Kisuke and Soul Bad Guy's swords. I don't know why you would lock this feature behind beating the game once. It had me disappointed for most of my playthrough that I would see all of these cool weapons in the menu, but there was nothing to do with them. Sure, I can understand having some special unlocks for beating the game or doing some optional content or getting a certain rating behind beating the game once, like Kai Kisuke and Soul Bad Guy's weapons are, but these swords are all purely cosmetic. They don't change the gameplay of the game at all, at least from all the ones that I unlocked and tried. What is the harm in allowing the player to equip the weapons of optional bosses during the first playthrough? In my opinion, that only incentivizes you to seek them out more, which these optional bosses' gameplay certainly isn't going to. It is really funny to see some of the massive swords used by larger characters and how they barely fit into the screen when attached to you, as they have to function like the normal katanas you use up until now, since it is purely a model swap. I think there is something really cool here with 7 Samurai 20XX. It has such an interesting blend of styles. It reminds me of so many things I loved seeing growing up that also came out around that time. It may not stand out mechanically, but just like Space Sheriff Spirits, it certainly does as a full package, being carried by its world and presentation, even if it's lacking in kinda jank and rough around the edges in areas. Like I said about the previously covered Sword of Destiny, this is a play if you want to check it out type game. If you aren't vibing with this game or simply don't have the time or the resources to play it, it's not the end of the world if you miss out on it or choose to skip it. I give this a firm okay rating, which is perfectly fine. Not everything can be the pinnacle of the genre, revolutionary, instant, underrated classic that is obscure and is a must play, or completely detestable bottom of the barrel. The list of games for this series at the time of recording this is at, I believe, 138, so there's no way that there aren't going to be some firm okay 6 out of 10s. Alright, I know this next one is actually for the Dreamcast, and this series has so far been titled Obscure PS2 Action Games, but I'm covering everything in the 6th generation, so they're getting into the compilation. Expect stuff occasionally for the Dreamcast, GameCube, and Xbox from here on out. Berserk, one of the most important manga ever made by one of the most gifted creators to ever grace the earth. The material is a no-brainer for getting a video game adaptation. We've already covered Yuke's second Berserk game for the PlayStation 2, so now it is time to look at their first attempt and the first Berserk game ever made, with Sword of Berserk: Guts' Rage, released in 1999 for the Sega Dreamcast. Now, part of me feels it is unfair to compare this game to its successor, but the PS2 Berserk game is such a massive leap in quality from the first one that I am going to end up comparing the two of them a lot, just to highlight how much better that game is, and just how middling the Dreamcast game unfortunately turned out. Obviously, you aren't always going to hit it out of the park on your first try. I usually expect most first entries in a series to be the awkward jank one, whose ideas would be ironed out in a much better sequel. Unless your name is Fear, where the first game is a masterpiece and the series progresses progressively only got more and more shit with each new installment. Unlike the PlayStation 2 game, which was covering the story of the manga, taking place just after the Tower of Conviction, when Guts and Casca are reunited and go on their journey together, The Sword of Berserk is an original story penned by Kentaro Miura, and it has all of the strengths of this man's writing that made me fall in love with his works in the first place. Part of me wishes this eventually got reincorporated into the manga itself, since the presentation of an early 3D game from 1999, with its lopsided English dub, is not doing the story justice. With the death of Kentaro Miura, that sadly will never happen. The music for this game was done by Susumu Hirasawa, the man who composed the music for the 1997 anime, and his tracks for this game are amazing. While I do wish that this game's narrative would have been converted to ink for the manga, the game does feature a lot of Miura original drawings, which are used in some pretty creative and clever ways, like how they use his character art for the painting of the royal family of the town, or for the flashbacks of any of the game's original characters. I love Miura's style. It's always a pleasure to see new art from him, even when it is tied to trash like the Grunbell original light novel. Yeah, we don't talk about that one. The localization of this game is a bit rough in places, nothing Berserk fans aren't accustomed to at this point, as characters refer to Guts as both Gatsu and Gutsu in this game. I do not know why they did this, since the title of the game is Guts' Rage, but I assume they thought it would be too awkward for the game to be called Gatsu's Rage instead. While I have your attention about the cover and title of this game, I have to show you just how terrible the PAL version of this game's cover art is. As you'd expect from this era, the Japanese version is the best, as it is art just by Kentaro Miura. The American version is just CGI character renders from this game, but the PAL version is someone's MS Paint drawing of part of Guts' face. It looks like a texture from Cruelty Squad. The English dub features a lot of old school early PlayStation 1 voice actors, mostly famous for their roles in early Konami games, like Puck is voiced by Cam Clark, aka Liquid Snake. There is an undub and retranslation of this game, which I will link in the description below, and if you are someone who actually owns a Dreamcast, then you can just burn that ROM to a CD and pop that bitch right into the console, since it doesn't have any copyright protection. The dub isn't terrible, it's mostly just annoying naming conventions we have long since moved past, and some cutscenes are poorly mixed, so some characters are too quiet and get droned out, and of course, there are no subtitles in the official release, another reason to play the fan patch. Even with the dub and visual shortcomings, the story still shines through because that's how good Kentaro Miura's writing is. I won't go into too many spoilers, as I think you should play the game yourself, but Sword of Berserk's narrative takes place in the perfect part of the story, in the early days of Guts and Casca's traveling together after Zod destroys Casca's hiding place during his fight with Guts in the graveyard. The manga already has a montage to show how many different scenarios and time has passed from when they left to when they eventually run into Serpico and Farnese. This is the gold mine for throwing in original stories, because you can just write it off like the game does, as Guts, Casca, and Puck wander into a new town and deal with the town's problems, or you run into some monsters or apostles, just like the stories that inspired Berserk, like Violence Jack and Fist of the North Star. The town in this game has a Mandragora infestation, which is infecting people, ending up dragging Guts into helping them for his own selfish reasons, as the serum the king is trying to make could return Casca to normal. We gotta get it out of the way now and address the fact that yes, the king of the town is indeed named Ballsack.
I'm Balzac, ruler of this town.
And yes, everyone says it with a straight face and takes him very seriously. This is something we are going to have to accept. Get your laughs in now, and let's move on. The gameplay is easily the roughest aspect of this game. You'd hope that it would be the #1 priority to get right, but sadly the sword swinging feels like ass. It's slow and stiff in ways that even if you wanted to say, well, it's accurately portraying how wielding the Dragon Slayer would feel, wouldn't apply to. It's very rigid, not allowing for much movement or redirecting at all, which, if you have read the manga, know that's how Guts uses the Dragon Slayer in a lot of fights. He uses his weight and inertia of the sword to lead his swings in the directions he wants to. While he is still using his strength to swing the sword, he is brilliantly and very intelligently using gravity to his advantage to help him out every chance he gets. If he was swinging a 500-pound 10-foot sword, he would at the very least be able to use the momentum to turn himself in different directions and not just stand in place like it's a kendo sword. That's how the PlayStation 2 game game does it, and it makes the combat feel much more fluid and weighty in all the right and satisfying ways. It feels much more free-form in the PlayStation 2 game, where in the Dreamcast game, its animations are stiff and almost too snappy. The fact that the game uses two buttons, A for vertical slashes and B for horizontal slashes, is probably a major contributing factor to this issue, since swinging on the X and Y axis is individually locked to their respective button, and do not allow for unique movements. There is one move that is only in this game and didn't come back for the PlayStation 2 entry that I love, which is the jumping vertical slash. It was likely an unintended result, but the momentum you can get from doing this move is so much fun to use, making Guts fly through levels like a missile. There is probably some insane speedrun tech you can use with this. The lack of a lock-on and the amount of hits most enemies need to kill them also makes combat feel much worse. You could argue that the fact that basic enemies mostly die in one hit in the PlayStation 2 game made it far too easy, and as a result they compensated by throwing endless droves of beasts at you. But this game still does that in areas like the forest versus enemies with much more infuriating hitboxes, not to mention the biggest glaring issue with this game, which is the fact that your sword bounces off all walls and objects that it collides with if it isn't these wooden destructible barrels and crates. 90% of this game is fought in narrow city streets, caves, and dungeon hallways. It feels like this is some sort of practical joke and the developers were actively trolling me by putting enemies in areas that I couldn't actually hit. They somehow always managed to do this as if their pathfinding was programmed to make it so they would always seek out the most obnoxious areas to stand in possible. It isn't until you are in rage mode, which automatically activates in this game after killing or being hit enough, do you get the ability to ignore wall collision and get to swing freely. So no, this is not the game trying to accurately portray how it is to play as Guts, otherwise they would not allow him to get to a point of anger and frustration that he can just ignore solid matter and defy the laws of reality. My guess is that they intended for you to use the hand-to-hand combat that is uniquely present in this game when your sword is on your back, but basic enemies take like 15 to 20 punches to even kill. Those are the normal dudes that take like 5 swings with your sword. I can't imagine how long and annoying it would be to try and kill any of the larger enemies with the hand-to-hand combat, like the larger knights carrying the lances which don't have any hit stun. These guys suck anytime they show up because they massively outrange you, have a really disjointed, constantly active hitbox with their spears, and do this one attack where they swing their lances over their head like it's a mace, and you just have to wait it out. You have no way to get in range to stop them without getting hit. So they just end up blocking off entire areas you are trying to fight in because, of course, they constantly show up in some of the most cramped encounter zones. You can block these moves by pressing Y in a neutral stance and not moving, but with the lack of a parry from the second game, this doesn't accomplish shit, so you can just sit there while these guys swing forever. Maybe if your items were stronger and not tied to limited ammo counts, they could actually be dealt with easier. The little bombs, which are so useful in a ton of areas in the PlayStation 2 game, are practically unusable here. The way Guts throws them feels completely arbitrary, and there is so much input delay or input eating present in this game that they often don't even go off, and if they do, they just fall directly down out of your hand to your feet instead of being thrown like they are supposed to. The cannon is mostly the same, just more limp with a much smaller radius. The game is very arcadey in nature, so you get new items after clearing areas, and anytime you die and use one of your 10 credits, you restart at a checkpoint with all of your items fully refunded. The breakable crates and barrels throughout the levels do drop items, but only a few of them do this. And good luck actually breaking most of these things since they are up against walls and in corners, so your sword bounces off the walls before it even has a chance to break and reach the objects while you're getting stabbed in the ass by enemies behind you. A lot of enemies also have the ability to grab on and bite you or shake you like a baby as if it was a Resident Evil game. Their grabs reach so far in some cases that you would think that they were Magneto.
Gravity squeeze!
The crawling enemies are the worst offenders of this, since they are already super hard to hit because their hitboxes are so low to the ground, and your sword swings aren't really going in directions to actually hit them. So given what I've said so far about the combat, it should come at no surprise that the boss fights aren't very good. They are still better than the Berserk Musou game, but that's not a very high bar to clear. I just did not have the logic to fight some of these bosses without taking damage, like the giant turnip, which you can apparently not take damage from its screaming attack by simply putting putting your sword up in front of you. The Dragon Slayer just absorbs all incoming sound like it's a tuning fork. Your fight with Zod feels like it's for a completely different game that controls far better. This was my biggest roadblock with the game since the stiffness made it hard to dodge attacks while actually doing anything more than a single hit while Zod's massive hitbox would send me flying. This fight shows us how night and day the combat feels without the parry present in the PlayStation 2 game, beating him the same way I beat Millennia. The more things change, the more they stay the same. Maybe that one post on Backlogged about this game was onto something. If you get stuck on any of the bosses, then you're likely to run into the game's pretty abysmal and misleading save system. Like we have previously already covered, the game has a very arcadey base to its design, so it uses a 10-credit live system. Once those credits run out, then it's a game over and kicks you back out to the main menu. When you load it back in, it'll start you back at the last time you saw this message, "New stage reached." This means you can possibly lose a huge amount of progress if it's near the Zod fight or in the castle at the end of the game, like it unfortunately was for me. At points like this, just do what I advised in my Berserk PS2 review. Simply run past the enemies you have to refight. It turns out only a few screens require you to kill all of the monsters to hit a zone transition, so unless it's stopping you, there's no real reason to subject yourself to the jank combat and annoying hitboxes any more than you have to. Where the save system reveals how poor its implementation is when you try to stop mid-session and want to take a break. At a point, I was starting to get pretty annoyed with the game. This was before the Zod fight that used up all of my credits. I knew I had only about an hour left in the game, but I thought it would be better to just take a break so I didn't force myself to complete the game as fast as I can so I could turn around and make a video on it as fast as possible and end up souring my experience on it, which is something that you can very easily do when you make videos on games. I also wanted to go back to the main menu and check if there was a subtitle setting that I missed and just didn't turn on. I wasn't really sure how to save the game, so I looked it up just to be sure, and some random post I found said to save and exit and it'll be fine. What this post fails to mention is that while it is going to save your progress, that doesn't mean it's actually going to save where you are. So you can be one room away from the next one of those and have to quit for whatever reason, thus requiring you to do all the bullshit of the previous hour again. I don't know why it does this, considering when you die and use a credit, the game has a ton of checkpoints that it spawns you at throughout levels. So if you saw this happen previously before quitting, this is where you would think it would start you at. There are a few unlockables for beating the game on different difficulties. For beating the game on easy, you get a mini game where you play as Puck. This game mode has you inside Guts' man bag, where you swat mandragoras as they fall into the Merce. For beating the game on normal, you get the Battle Arena, which is a time attack game mode where you can rematch the bosses and key encounters of the game. For beating the game on hard, you get No Limit, which allows you to play with unlimited ammo for your 4 pieces of gear. The Puck one is charming for 2 minutes, which is the amount of time it takes to play it once, but after that, none of these are particularly interesting or worth going for and unlocking. It's unfortunate to say, but the game is rather middling. It nails the visual aesthetics of Berserk. The character models may show their age now, but the environments still hold up. Their color choices match those of Miura's colored pages and artwork. For 1999, this is an excellent achievement for adapting the world of Berserk into an interactive 3D game. The story is tragic and bittersweet, giving the viewers a taste of what wouldn't be a plot point that is paid off for another 19 years. It's a pretty flawed game to the point that I would say it's incredibly flawed, but even in saying that, part of me still wants to recommend playing it. Maybe that's a cop-out answer after mostly shit-talking this game for 20 minutes, only to turn around and tell you to still play it anyways, but there is a piece of original Berserk story trapped to this game, and I think it's worth experiencing. The game is only roughly 2 to 3 hours long, so it's not even that much of a time investment. Play the game on easy, run past enemies if they get annoying, enjoy the story, and know that if you found this game's gameplay even slightly interesting or enjoyable, the PlayStation 2 game is a fully realized version of the Sword of Berserk Guts' Rage. But for this game, all you can do is try to make the most of it and enjoy the little videos of Puck on the controller's VMU. These rule. I wish we could still do stuff like this. God of War is, in my opinion, the game that changed the trajectory of the action game genre in the mid-2000s in a similar way to what the original Devil May Cry did when it first came out in 2001. I wanted to save this observation for after I had finished covering all the 6th gen action games and started covering 7th gen titles, but now is as good a time as any to get into this theory. After Devil May Cry, like Doom did for the FPS, it created a lot of games that wanted to follow in its footsteps because it showed what could be done with the medium. We got got games that were very direct clones and inspired by it, like Van Helsing, Spawn Armageddon, the list could go on, with varying degrees of levels of influence present. Then there were also the games that used the success of Devil May Cry to be able to go in their own direction as the other side of the action game coin, like Ninja Gaiden. But after God of War came out in 2005, you started to see a shift. Instead of games following the Devil May Cry formula, containing its DNA like style meters, devil trigger like power-ups, a focus on free-flowing combat with extensive interwoven combos and so on, more games, especially the Western-made ones, started to take cues from God of War instead, trying to match its scale of environments and set pieces and an emphasis on more crowd control, less style-focused combat. You'll notice a downtick of style meters and an uptick in QTEs. It's something hard to convey with words, but a lot of the action games post God of War had a game feel more reminiscent to it than Devil May Cry. By the 7th gen, if you had to compare the amount of games that you could say were Devil May Cry inspired or God of War inspired, God of War likes would vastly outnumber the opposition. It's very much a gradient and not a binary thing of this is like Devil May Cry and this is like God of War, and that's not to say that games like Devil May Cry did not come out during this period. We saw Platinum hit their stride and make a household name for themselves during this era, and there are other contributing factors that aren't entirely reliant on the existence and success of the original God of War, like the context of Japanese game studios struggling in the advent of HD game development with the release of the PlayStation 3 and Xbox 360, along with the downtick of AA middle-of-the-shelf and movie tie-in like games. We got less and less to the point that we don't really see these low-budget experimental action games anymore, but indie developers are trying to pick up the slack that was left for the past decade or so. But there were a lot of games that simply felt like God of War or wanted to be like God of War. They may have not invented it, but I swear there was an uptick of games that had things like this very specific wall climbing, just to give you an idea of how influential certain aspects of the gameplay loop of God of War was. But before God of War, there was a game that was a perfect blend of Devil May Cry, Onimusha / Resident Evil, and Metroid design to make an epic of traversing realms and slaying gods with Rygar the Legendary Adventure. Now I want to nip this talking point in the bud as fast as possible before it takes up all the oxygen in the room. Do I think that God of War ripped this game off? No. These games are really nothing alike outside of both having a main character that fights with a weapon on a chain and uses Greek mythology as a base for its narrative and aesthetics. Said weapons and characters don't play remotely alike, the stories have nothing in common unless you boil things down to their most basic aspects and are making massive stretches, and even then I would say they weren't that similar. It's like saying that Necrovision and Call of Duty World at War are the same game, and one of those has the evil pizza from Jimmy Neutron appear in the sky and talk to you. And even this comparison has more weight to it than between Rygar and God of War, because Necrovision actively makes fun of and parodies Call of Duty in certain bits.
This is the Call of Duty.
What a load of bullshit.
Like the previously covered Altered Beast, Rygar was originally an arcade side-scroller that would later be ported to the Commodore 64, ZX Spectrum, and a whole bunch of other shit that is too old for any of us to have ever played. The game we are covering in this video is its PlayStation 2 third-person reboot. Rygar is a warrior of Argus who has no memories other than war. He is fighting to bring peace to Princess Britney Spears. Seriously, this chick looks so much like Britney Spears that I had to look up if she was the face model or not, thinking that did she give her likeness and was a model for this game for some reason, like she was convinced it would be good for her popularity since other celebrities were hopping on this bandwagon, or knowing what we know now about her situation during the 2000s, was she forced by her crazy controlling abusers? For the longest time, I was so convinced it was her, especially with events that happened near the end of the game, which we'll get into later in the video, but to my understanding, it isn't actually Britney Spears doing a cameo from what digging I did. They just said fuck it and made a character that looks just like her. Illidan shows up with with the Titans and smites Rygar down while taking Britney Spears captive. Rygar hears a voice calling out to him and is brought back to life, promising that he would never turn his back against evil. The first thing I really want to talk about is the aesthetics of this game. Now, this isn't to say that there weren't games like this. There definitely were others, but Rygar is such a vibrantly colorful game for something in the action, pseudo-character action genre. A lot of these games are very dark, gray, brown, or green, similar to DMC 1 through 3, but there is something almost pastel about the colors of this game. There are, though, still the colors that you would expect from this genre, time period in both the context of gaming and its location choices. The character designs and aesthetics are another thing I want to call attention to. They are something only found during the 6th generation. Graphics got good enough to make pretty close approximations to the human form, but it wasn't like now where you can do very detailed photorealism and face scans, so these games had this perfect blend and sweet spot of realistic designs and proportions, but also still had the essence of fantastical cartoonishness to them. At a glance, Rygar looks to have a realistic human male form, but then when you look at him long enough, you see the proportions are kinda off. I love this type of stuff. I'm sad to see that games moved away from designs and art direction like this in the advent of photorealism and hyper HD graphics. It's design techniques like this that help things like the game's opening CG cinematic hold up well. Sure, the people, especially their faces, have a rubbery, shiny finish to them, but otherwise contains interesting choreography, well-framed cinematography, and is just overall well-paced. The environments of this game are very impressive. You know me, I love my fixed perspective adventures where the art designers have full control of where you are going to be looking at all times, so they can make as interesting of a room as possible. The rooms are even destructible in this game, which most of the time doesn't do much beyond the visual spectacle of it, but I definitely gave Rygar a bit of CTE from letting part of this broken boulder fall on his head. These environments perfectly capture the Roman architecture while also featuring unique blends with Egyptian and Mediterranean aesthetics at times when the opportunity arises, which becomes all the more fitting with narrative contexts from the end of the game. As always with these videos, expect spoilers, but I want to put a warning here so people can go play the game for themselves and see these things going in completely blind like I did. Go play it, it's pretty good and not very long, just make sure you rotate your saves, trust me. I think saying I was blown away is overselling it, but this was not what I was expecting for the final area of the game to look like when I stepped off that teleporter. Yeah, those little floating islands off in the distance, you get to go to those. The scale of these areas is also further elevated from the level it reaches with the camera angles, color choices, and interactivity thanks to the really enjoyable soundtrack. It is a little easy to get lost in some of these zones because of the odd inconspicuous screen transition leap of faith, or not realizing that part of this is something you can jump to or interact with. It also doesn't help that the map is mostly shit unless inside specific areas where you can view the floors individually, since the overworld map is super zoomed out and hard to tell what the hell you are looking at. The minimap can also be less helpful than you need it to be, as some paths can appear super small so it's easy to miss them, like in the turning towers where I did not notice the little divot or notch here, which signifies a doorway which you need to go through. Like I mentioned at the start, the game has that Resident Evil Metroid styled level design where you can go back to previous areas with new powers to further explore and unlock more things. The annoying part is that most of the powers are acquired in the back half of the game, or you could only go back to old areas with certain new powers near the very end. It's also very out of the way and time consuming to do, to the point that it loses that potential satisfying feeling games like it have built their dynasties and entire genre on. To my knowledge, the only way for you to truly backtrack is by using these few teleporters which bring you back to a part of the hub. You can retrace your steps to some extent in the zones themselves, but usually you will find that there is a bit that is cut off because you previously dropped down a hole or something of the like, so you have to take one of these teleporters back and then travel from the hub to the zone you want to. Then once you are done in that area, you can either continue forward back to the teleporter teleporter to go to the hub again, or continue on to whatever the current zone leads you to, or turn around and come back all the way you came from if possible, which in some cases may be a shorter walk than it is to walk to the teleporter later in the level. Your walk speed isn't exactly the fastest, and your walk animation also creates the illusion as if you're walking in slow motion, because your feet move back and forth faster than the distance you cover, so there is this disconnect in your brain that you're going to notice. It's like running in a nightmare. One of the first things you see in the hub area is this cube thing that you cannot move. There are a bunch of them that you'll run into throughout the game, but to move them is the last ability you get, and the first teleporter you'll run into after getting it is locked for a while until you beat a couple bosses. Then it becomes the most out of the way and time consuming thing to go back to for rewards that honestly don't even feel worth it. The game either needed to make teleporters, or better yet, a system to allow you to fast travel around with ease, like being able to warp to the lion heads you save at, even if this ability to teleport was saved as an endgame power-up / reward, or feature more interconnected level design so it was easier to go back to because areas loop in on themselves much more than the final product we actually got. The combat of Rygar is fairly simplistic and straightforward. When you reawaken from being attacked by the Titans, you find the disc armor. Think of it like the prototype dual discs Kaiba used against Joey, except it has spikes on the end of it and spins like a frisbee. You have a few combos and the hit feedback is weighty enough that it is satisfying, but you do feel a bit stiff with the starting disc since you are somewhat locked in place when swinging. It is an oversized yo-yo, so I do get that you have to have your feet planted into the ground to be able to swing this thing back and forth. The second disc you get is your crowd control option, as it has wide massive sweeps in front of you. The drawback is that it is pretty slow, so at times it doesn't really help in large encounters that it's meant to be used in because you get hit and interrupted before it even reaches them. You can keep the disc extended and have it move around like a weed whacker, which is pretty funny. The third weapon is where the game really opens up combat-wise. It is the most unique and interesting of the three, and it is the most fun to use. It is a super fast close-range disc and has a ton of combos and launchers, and has a second ability where you throw it on the ground and after a while it will come back to you following the path you took while it was placed. This ability is really cool. It's just a shame that I found myself having trouble actually using it in combat. It doesn't have the most practical application outside of a few instances, but nonetheless I still tried to make it work. Each weapon has a summon you can call on to do a magic AoE attack. There are 3 levels to this, corresponding to the weapon's level, which can be raised using the orbs enemies and breakable environmental objects drop. The weapons also have a materia system where you can plug these orbs into them for buffs and bonuses. Sadly, I seem to have missed most of them on my first go through, and the ones I did find from exploring and backtracking were pretty lackluster, and I often didn't even notice the bonuses that they were supposed to be giving me. All of the good ones either require you to do the challenge tower at the very end of the game or play it on the hardest difficulty, at least based on what this IGN guide says. Also, some of the good materia give you access to things that I personally believe should have just been something you had right from the get-go and didn't need some sort of item or power-up which has limited slots and tied to each individual weapon when giving it to you. Like, one of them gives you invincibility frames on jump, you know, the thing that Devil May Cry 1 just gave you right from the start. This is why I found a lot of the exploration and backtracking really underwhelming, because when I would find these rewards, they weren't very good. The bosses of this game are pretty hit or miss, with most being misses. It's the same issue that pretty much all of the lesser mechanically depthful action games suffer from. Hitboxes can be awkward and disjointed, damage from them is really high while not giving you many windows to actually hit them, while having a lot of attacks that animation lock you in place. A lot of them are more styled to be set pieces, but don't have the interactivity like the QTE's God of War would go with for its bosses. You have DMC3 Cerberus at home, but oh wait, actually that game came out later, and this one was first, so I guess you can call Cerberus a gourmet version of this guy. I don't know, we could workshop this term and come back later. God, the fish boss is such a pain in the ass. It often is just out of reach of your swing, so you can't hit it, and when you do, it rams right into the ice platform you are running on, which sends you flying and will stun lock you to death, as it juggles you down the length of a football field. My solution for this was using the placement ability with the third disc so it would keep pace with the fish as it was destroying the runway moving forward. The damage from this attack seemed to be building if it's hitting the same enemy multiple times, so when this would work, it would melt huge chunks of the boss's health bar. The only issue is that this thing's AI feels so random, so sometimes it would just stand there doing nothing just out of your your range, so the ability will time out before it even moves and you don't have the time to reset it up. Otherwise, you risk getting stun locked down the football field again. Some bosses like the Red Boa are so hard to hit with your weapons that I only damaged them by using my summons. I was super lucky I had enough mana and mana items on me that I was able to do this, otherwise I would have just been stuck. Illidan is completely invulnerable when he has this red mist around him, and for some reason in my playthrough he just didn't turn it off like he did in other long plays that I consulted because I felt like I was doing something wrong. Fighting this guy feels like utter bullshit because you can't hit him, and the only times you would be able to is when he's flying over my head out in the sky completely out of my reach about to dive bomb me. I only beat him because on the attempt that I did, he actually turned off his playground total invincibility barrier and never turned it back on. The other aspect that hurts the bosses is their placement and the gauntlets they end up creating. There are a few spots in this game where you have back-to-back boss fights without the ability to save, heal, or get more resources. You can easily soft lock yourself if you are very unlucky, which is why I recommend to always be rotating your saves. It's a good habit to get into even if you aren't making videos on games and need access to specific points in games for footage. I almost completely trapped myself at one point because I beat the final boss of the first gauntlet and was left at 1 HP and had no way to heal myself, and nothing in the environment was dropping any items. So I had to carefully traverse the next area multiple times and slowly try to fight the second most obnoxious enemy in the game, hoping that one of them would drop a much needed heal. The final gauntlet is a real ballbuster. You have your fight with Illidan, who is revealed to actually be Aristotle, and you guys are interrupted by Britney Spears so she can have an MTV music video to get you guys to stop fighting. I'm not kidding, this isn't a joke. Imagine if in Devil May Cry 1, Trish jumped through a window during the third Nello Angelo fight and did this.
What do you know about me?
Wait.
The sun smiles down on us. This whole new world.
This is the most out of left field thing in this game, and it felt like I was given a modded copy with a shitpost patched into it. Stuff like this is why I don't think that Rygar and God of War are really anything alike beyond surface level similarities. After you kill the monster form of Aristotle, where he turns into a baby-headed Hydra, you open the gates to hell, do some basic encounters, then you have a rematch with a boss from earlier, the Minotaur, except he's invisible for some reason this time. Then you have a fight against your mother Cleopatra. Yeah, it turns out that Rygar was the son of Cleopatra and Julius Caesar. She got turned into a demon, so you have to have this really fucking annoying fight with her as she spawns the most annoying enemy in the game, the little spiders that are super hard to hit because of their tiny hitbox and explode when you kill them, so they are usually dealing damage to you even if you manage to kill them in time. After you narrowly beat her, you are sent directly into another boss fight versus Kronos. The game throws so many tough fights at you back to back that I exhausted all of my resources at this point and had to play perfectly or lose. There is this one part of the game that I have not brought up yet in this video, which are these items that are found throughout the game, and when you pick them up, they tell you that in finding this collectible, you have thus changed the future. For the longest time, I had no clue what this meant and what this actually changed in the game, thinking that maybe there were multiple endings and in finding them I would get the true ending or set me on a different path, but after a quick Google search, it turns out that these seem to just unlock concept art. So who actually cares? They're presented in this super misleading way. They weren't making a difference in any of these boss fights. Before I Googled this, I thought maybe I'm struggling so much because I haven't found all of these things that is making it difficult, or maybe because I have found all of them, this is making the game harder because I'm on the true path, but that wasn't the case. I really hate when games do gauntlets like this, especially if the bosses take a decent amount of time to fight. It was the entire reason I dropped Dino Crisis 3 right at the finish line, because I couldn't beat all of those bosses it wanted you to in a single life when you have a pea shooter for a weapon. Rygar would later go on to get a port to the Wii a few years later, and for some reason they changed Rygar's design. If anything, I would say that maybe this is trying to tap into the God of War success, since they have him with red tattoos and made him much more pale, but in all honesty, he looks a lot more like Father Nier than Kratos. The game is pretty enjoyable, it has some pretty glaring issues. It's another one of those okay 6 to 7 out of 10 games that we have started to get into now that we've covered most of the interesting games, or at least the ones that are really jumping jumping out to me as being interesting, but this is also only the 19th released review, which at the time of recording I have 145 games planned for this series, and I've also only played about a little over 40 of them for any amount of time more than just checking that they work or that they fit the genre. I'd still recommend it, but like other games we've previously covered, if you aren't enjoying it, I don't really think it's worth to see it through to the end. Just try to get as much enjoyment out of it, and once that stops being the case, just tap out. There's really no harm in doing so. You're not going to be missing any life-changing, earth-shattering experiences here. If you've made it this far into the video, I just want to say thank you for watching as always. If you really liked the video, then please leave a like, subscribe, and maybe pass the video around. If you want to support the channel and see more videos like this, maybe consider becoming a patron on Patreon. All patrons get access to videos a day early, along with a $3 tier allowing you to vote for upcoming multi-game reviews, a $7 tier where you get to see rough cuts of upcoming videos, and I am now going to shout out all of my $5 and up patrons who really help support the channel. Andy F, Bully, Densha, Turbo Chicken, Scary Dinosaur, Burley, Dev Welkin, Fish Kami, Jordan Bennett, Kevin Velasquez, Kohai Carmen, Lotto, Medi Not the Bad Guy, MGS Duh, Quartz, Samuel Egan, Sayin Heggy, Slemph Tingle, Speedo Weedo Wagon, Metal Cactus, Alec Joseph, Ben Johnson, Buckets, Chichometrius, Cursed Void, Ek Frazo, Filthy Fingers 69, Hardleg Joe, Jacob Hamilton, Lazy Titan, Leon, Nicholas Patinato, Vittori Bursky, Shisaji, Tabriz Sadiq, and Neutral Guy. Thanks so much, everyone. If you're a card game player of any kind, I have a TCG Player affiliate link in the description below. All purchases you make using my link will give me a small kickback. I also have a NordVPN affiliate link, so any plans that you get using my link will also help support the channel. As for what's coming out next, I have a lot of videos currently in the work trying to get a bunch of stuff out while it's ad season at the end of the year. This includes Capcom's JoJo Part 5 action game, a Halloween video that I'm desperately trying to rush to get it done in time, some more PS2 action games, and a couple more fun little surprises. As always, thanks for watching, and see you next time.